I want to start off with a question today. What do we mean when we say don't judge a book by its cover? That's a pretty common statement, and hopefully an answer comes to your mind right away. We mean don't judge things at a first glance. Don't take surface judgment to affect how we feel about someone or something. And the reason I ask that is because we're in John chapter 7, and if you look down at verse 24, Jesus summarizes his statement here in verse 24, and he says, "Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment." Now, don't judge a book by its cover. You can go a little bit with that statement here, but Jesus is actually going quite a bit farther than just that statement that we commonly think of. That's the statement that comes to mind for me when I read this verse. But we need to dig a little bit deeper than just don't judge a book by its cover. All right, there's a lot more to it than that. So as we begin today in John chapter 7, per usual, I'd like you to pause the video, pray, and then I want you to read chapter 7, start in verse 10, and then read all the way down through verse 24 to get the context for the whole passage that we're looking at today. All right, so do that. All right, as we looked in the last segment, in verses 1 through 13, there's the Feast of the Tabernacles that has begun, or is starting and then begins. And then Jesus actually delays going up to the feast. He's going to go, but he delays going to the feast because, if you look back in verse 1, Jewish leadership has been looking for him because they want to kill him. And so he goes to the feast, but he goes so that they can't catch him, essentially. All right? But then he is going to present truth and teach like he's been intending to do. Okay? So that was where we left off in the last segment. So we're going to pick up in verse 14 here. And this first couple of verses that we're going to look at, really the overall thought here is the suspicion about Jesus' teaching, the suspicion of his teaching. Okay, and that's verses 14 and 15. So verse 14, it says, "Now about the midst of the feast," a couple days into the feast, remember it's a 7 to 8 day feast, "Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled." Okay, let's pause there for a moment. Because Jesus, he starts teaching, and his teaching causes, the word here is marvel or amazement, but there's, I want us to think about this. I want us to think about this in this way, okay? Read the rest of verse 15. It says, "And the Jews marveled, saying, 'How knoweth this man letters, having never learned?'" Now, I just read it in that tone of voice, okay? I want you to pause, and I want you to ask that question that they ask in verse 15, and ask it in different tones of voice, because I want us to be thinking about how are the Jewish leadership, how are they asking this question? So his teaching causes amazement, and I think that is amplified because of his lack of education. All right, and here's what I mean by that. Okay, think about their question, verse 15. Think about the tone of their question if they ask it like this. Like we think like amazement, wonder, and even the way I read the question right off the bat, I try to just read it neutrally. But think about it if you ask the question in this way. Verse 15, "And the Jews marveled, saying, 'How knoweth this man letters, having never learned?'" If you put an accusatory aspect to their tone, it kind of changes the way they ask the question. And I believe that sheds light on Jesus' response that you read through all the way down through verse 24. Okay? I think the Jewish leadership, are asking this question in an accusatory way. Because think about this. Jesus is not teaching anything wrong. Okay? The Pharisees, the Jewish leadership, they cannot contradict what he's teaching. So they are instead attacking his credentials in this way. The Jewish leaders are asking, where's his authority come from to teach like this? He hasn't been formally taught by a rabbi. Okay, in our vernacular today, we'd say this guy hasn't been to Bible college. This guy hasn't been to seminary. What gives him the authority to teach like this? That's essentially what they're saying. Because a lot of times in this culture, in Jewish culture, teachers would be associated with a rabbi that they learned under. Okay, that a rabbi that discipled them, and Jesus has no affiliation like that. So the Jews are saying he hasn't been taught by a rabbi. He has no formal education that we know of. So an accusatory tone makes the Jews' statement here, their question, much more clear, and then it makes Jesus' following statements that much more clear, I believe. So really the issue here, the issue with their question is it relates back to their lack of belief in Jesus. And that's what starts all of this. So then when Jesus answers them, he's going to go into his authority to teach. All right? So let's start in verse 16. Jesus answered them and said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself." So what's Jesus saying here? His authority comes from God. He says, my doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. He's saying, I'm teaching God's doctrine, so I'm teaching on God's authority. Now, I just read you verse 17, but I want you to pause, read verse 17 again, and then answer this question. What is Jesus saying in verse 17? Pause and ask that question. What's Jesus saying in verse 17? Now, it relates to what we were just talking about and what Jesus is saying in verse 16. Okay, my doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself. So Jesus is saying anyone can test his teaching against the Old Testament. Okay, the Jews have the Old Testament. They need to compare what Jesus is saying to God's words in the Old Testament. Think about it this way too, in verse 17. If any man will do his will. Jesus is speaking in this way, that obedience to God will lead to a right knowledge of Jesus. If any man will do his will, be obedient to God, he shall know of the doctrine. So it's like Jesus talked about in chapter 6 that we just finished up, okay? You can start in the Old Testament. You can start at Genesis. You can start with God, work your way all the way through the Old Testament and come to the time of Jesus. And when Jesus comes, and you can say, yes, knowledge of God leads me all the way to Jesus, the true Messiah. In like manner, you can start with Jesus and you can work your way back to God creating the world and sending his son to redeem the world. Okay? It all lines up. So what's Jesus then saying in verse 17? What's that statement then say about the religious leaders? Jesus is implying and really saying that the religious leaders are not being obedient to God. They're not following God. They're following Mosaic law. That means a lot to them. But if they would rightly study and seek to know God, they would come to a right relationship with Jesus. So, in a way, Jesus' statement is an insult to them. But it needs to be said because these Jewish leaders are lost and they need Jesus. And so they need Jesus to give them truth, whether they see that or not, and they don't see that here. What does Jesus go on to say then? Let's read down to verse 18. He that speaks of himself seeks his own glory, but he that seeks his glory that sent him, the same is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. What's Jesus saying here in verse 18? He's saying anyone's teaching can be tested. Okay, just like he was implying in verse 17. He says, look at the Old Testament and compare my teaching to that. In verse 18, he says, he's essentially saying that someone who is promoting themselves exposes a selfish motive. Jesus isn't promoting himself. He's giving God the Father's message. So the promotion of God the Father exposes Jesus' right motive. He that seeks his glory that sent him, the same is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Just like a master is going to send a message to someone, and so he gives a message to his servant and says, deliver this message. That servant is not trying to promote himself. All he's doing is delivering the message that his master has given him. It's not about the servant, it's about the master. And so the message that servant delivers it's the master's message. It's just that. It's pure, it's untainted. There's no spin on it. It's not about the servant at all. It's about the master's message. That's what Jesus is saying here. It's about God the Father's message. Now, when we get to verse 19, Jesus suddenly changes course. I don't know if you caught that as you read through this passage right off the bat, but he really changes course here, and it's almost like he goes on the attack a little bit. He goes from talking about his authority and motive to he suddenly moves to the Jewish leadership wanting him dead, and that causes a bit of a stir. So let's work through these next several verses, okay? Because if you notice, he says in verse 19. He ends verse 19, why go ye about to kill me? He says in verse 21, I've done one work and ye all marvel. Now he's referencing the healing of the lame man that he did on the Sabbath in the same temple on the Sabbath, maybe close to a year earlier, okay? So he goes back to referencing that. Why does he do that? Why does Jesus bring up this act from at least 9 months or so earlier? Because Jesus, as he knows they're questioning his authority, and they're questioning his teaching, and so he is now transitioning to the root of their unbelief. The root of their unbelief. Read through the end of the passage again here. Read down through verse 24 again, and ask yourself this question. What's holding the religious leaders back from believing in Jesus? What's holding them back? There's a lot to unpack here in these last several verses. But I'd submit to you, and this is what I want us to be thinking about as we work our way through these last several verses, that as before, the Jewish leadership, they have their preconceived religious framework. And that's what's holding them back from changing their minds about Jesus. So these last several verses, let's talk about Jesus' intent in his teaching. What's his intention? He's not just defending a miraculous act, okay? He's not just defending himself. He's trying to get them to see their own hearts. Verse 19 through 21, Jesus is telling them that the Jewish leadership is acting hypocritically. They're acting like hypocrites. Okay, verse 19, he says, didn't Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keep the law? Okay, he says, no one can keep the law. Okay, we realize that. No man can keep the law. He says, why go ye about to kill me? So they want Jesus dead for that one act, that one healing of the lame man that he did. They want to kill Jesus for that. But they know that nobody can keep the law. Okay, now, again, let's clarify, Jesus was not breaking the law by healing that man. And he's going to clarify that even more. Now, in verse 20, when Jesus says, why go you about to kill me? In verse 20, the people answer and said, thou hast a devil, or they're basically calling him demon-possessed. Who's trying to kill you? So the people as a whole, they do not realize the intention of the Jewish leadership, the religious leadership. They don't realize that there's people trying to kill Jesus. And that statement's going to be even clarified even more as we work our way through the chapter. Okay, so that's Jesus' point, is that the Jewish leadership is acting hypocritically. And then here's Jesus' proof. His proof in that statement is that the Jews, they give exception to themselves regarding the Sabbath. Verse 21, Jesus answered and said unto them, I've done one work, and ye all marvel. Moses gave unto you circumcision, not because it's of Moses, but of the fathers. And ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. If a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are ye angry at me, because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? So, what's Jesus' whole point in bringing this up? Is that as strict as the Jewish leadership was on the Sabbath, you can't do any work on the Sabbath. You can't spit on the Sabbath. You can't write anything down on the Sabbath. You can't walk more than several feet on the Sabbath, because you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. So Jesus healing a man on the Sabbath, that's work, and he should be killed for it. That's how extreme they're being. And what Jesus points out here is he says, okay, the Sabbath is a big deal to you, and yet circumcision, the Jewish practice of circumcision is a big deal to you, and you let circumcision override the Sabbath. It's a big deal to you, and so you allow that to be done on the Sabbath. So you allow work to be done, but then I do something good. I make a man whole. I heal him, completely heal him from his paralysis, and that's what you're going to come after me about. But you'll allow yourself to do the work that you want to do, that you think is important on the Sabbath. So think about this. The Jewish leadership, Pharisees, they were unwilling to show Jesus the grace that they afforded to themselves. Now, I want you to pause here for a minute, and this might take you a few minutes to think about this. Because I want you to pause and think about that fact. And I want you to ask, what do I do that makes me like the Pharisees here? Think about it. So, I hope you came up with some good answers. This is a deep question to think about. You really got to kind of work and struggle your way through that question, because it's a hard question. So again, they were willing to show themselves grace. They gave themselves grace, or they gave themselves a pass when it came to the Sabbath, but they wouldn't show that same grace to Jesus. So how do we do that? How do I do that? Here's a real simple thought for all of you who have your driver's license, and as you get more comfortable driving, and how often do we not show grace or give people a pass when we're driving down the road? Think about it. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Someone is speeding. Someone is riding your bumper because they want to pass you. Someone doesn't use their turn signal. All these things that I know I get frustrated about with other drivers. And it's so easy to get so frustrated at someone out on the road and forget how often I do the same things. Sometimes I forget to use my turning signal. But then I just say, oh, I just forgot. I just got distracted and the turn came out too fast and I just forgot. And so I'll give myself grace. I'll give myself a pass. I'm running late, so then I'm driving fast, and then so I need to pass this person. But I give myself grace to do that. Oh, I had to do that. Okay, they were driving super slow. I had to get around them. Okay, oops, I have to get to this exit, so I accidentally cut somebody off. It was an accident. Sorry. But whenever that happens to me on the road, the person who did that to me, the person who didn't use their turning signal, they are the worst human being on the planet. That's how we treat it. At least that's how some of us treat it. Let's take that a little bit deeper into the personal life. How often do our siblings do something? Maybe they legitimately sin against us in some way. and we get so frustrated, we get so mad at them. And we will not stop to think about the fact that we do the same things, maybe in a different way. Or we say, oh man, my dad, he's so irritating. Or my mom, why does she bug me about this? And we don't stop to think about how I do it. Right back to them, maybe just in a different way. I'll tell you where this really gets convicting is if you're married and you can get irritated at your spouse. And it's very easy to get irritated at your spouse about something and overlook the fact that you do the same thing, that I do the same thing. And so that's what the Pharisees are doing to Jesus here. They will not show him the grace that they show themselves. So that's why Jesus says in verse 24, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. The Pharisees would not look any farther, any closer at Jesus than what they wanted to. They chose this one thing about him, and that's what they got hung up on. And that's where we can a little bit we can relate the illustration of don't judge a book by its cover. Okay, you can't just look at a book and be like, oh, I don't like the cover of that book, I don't want to read it. Okay, you don't know what's on the inside of the book. All right, sometimes we can tell. And we do the same thing with people. We're not supposed to do that. We shouldn't just judge people by their appearance. Okay, people's appearance can tell us a little bit about themselves, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Okay, Jesus is going a lot deeper than that. He's telling them, don't just look at this one thing about me and deny me. Don't just take this one thing about Jesus and then just throw him out because of that one thing that you're hung up on. So Jesus he's preaching to a religious leadership that is unwilling to listen, and they're unwilling to change. And so this is where we'll end. We're at verse 24. We'll end here. And maybe there's different points of application that are coming to your mind. If there is, I hope that you stop and you think about those and you let God's word convict you. But here's where I'll end it for us, is that both for salvation and for sanctification, for growth in Christ, we have to be willing to be honest before God and his word, and to be willing to be obedient and change when God exposes things about ourselves and shows us things that we need to change. That has to happen for salvation, and that has to happen for sanctification. I hope that's a challenge to you today. I hope it's an encouragement, but then also a challenge, that we need to be open before God and honest and obedient in front of him. And when we do that, that's where God can work in our lives and cause us to grow, when we're honest and we're obedient before him. Hope that's an encouragement. Thanks for watching and listening and paying attention today. So hope that's a blessing.